If your house in Canada was framed between 1950 and 1990, the lumber that holds your roof up was almost certainly cut by MacMillan Bloedel, the British Columbia forestry giant whose name was stamped on the dimension lumber that built suburban Saskatoon, Calgary, Hamilton, and most of the towns in between. At its peak, MacBlo employed 24,500 people and controlled a coastal forest the size of Switzerland. They survived 2 world wars, survived the Great Depression, survived the collapse of their own shipping arm in 1975, the worst BC forestry recession since the 30s, a 40-year war over Clayoquot Sound, and a $368 million loss in 1997. And then, on a single weekend at a hotel in Richmond in June of 1999, after 80 years of cutting trees on the British Columbia coast, the company was sold. How does something that survived all of that simply disappear? What happened in that hotel? Chapter 1. Lost. 1 cent. The story doesn't begin on the BC coast. It begins on a small farm at Pine Orchard, Ontario, about 30 miles north of Toronto, in the autumn of 1885. A Quaker farm where the soil was thin, the winters were long, and the boy who would one day own the forests of British Columbia was born into a household that counted its pennies and grieved them when they went missing. His name was Harvey Reginald MacMillan. His father died young. His mother held the farm together through a kind of stubborn endurance that ran through both sides of the family, and her son inherited it. Years later, after he had become the most decorated industrial forester in the British Empire, MacMillan's biographers would find his childhood diary in the family papers and stop on a single entry, written in a careful schoolboy hand. Lost. 1 cent. It was the kind of loss a Pine Orchard farm boy could not afford to write off. He recorded it the way a man might record a death. He grew up reading by lamplight, working the land before school, and looking, already, for a way out. Out of the thin soil, out of the long winters, out of the small economy of a Quaker farm where a penny was a thing to be mourned. The route he chose was the one Canada was only beginning to build: a degree in agricultural science from the Ontario Agricultural College in 1906, and then a graduate program in forestry, not at McGill or Toronto, but at Yale, where in 1908 he received a Master of Science as one of the first university-trained foresters anywhere in North America. He had survived tuberculosis to get there. The cure, in those years, was rest in the mountain air, and MacMillan took it with the same patience he had taken everything else. He came out of the sanatorium thinner, harder, and with the same calm intelligence that had always set him apart. In 1912, at 27 years old, the British Columbia government appointed him the province's first chief forester, the man responsible for building from scratch a forest service in a province whose timber wealth nobody had yet learned how to count. He counted it. He walked the coast. He inventoried the great cedars of the Fraser Delta and the Douglas firs of southern Vancouver Island and the Sitka spruce that ran in tight grain up into the rain-soaked mountains of Haida Gwaii. He drafted the first regulations. He hired the first wardens. And then the war came. By 1915, MacMillan was in Ottawa as assistant director of the Imperial Munitions Board, and from there he traveled to Australia, to New Zealand, to India, to South Africa, to Hong Kong and Shanghai and back, as Canada's Special Trade Commissioner for Timber. The Royal Flying Corps needed Sitka spruce, lightweight and strong-grained, for the wings of its warplanes. The only stand of large Sitka spruce in the British Empire grew on the islands the Haida called Haida Gwaii. MacMillan arranged the shipments. The spruce that brought down German fighters over the Western Front had been cut from forests that had stood since before Columbus. He came home in 1919 with 2 things he had not possessed before. The first was a global address book. Buyers in London and Sydney and Cape Town and Yokohama, who now knew his name. The second was a London partner, a timber merchant named Montague Meyer, who had watched MacMillan negotiate the imperial contracts and decided this Canadian was the man he wanted on the other end of a trans-Pacific business. Meyer put up $10,000. MacMillan mortgaged his house to match it. The H.R. MacMillan Export Company was incorporated in Vancouver in June. the first locally owned BC lumber export brokerage. It would survive the founder by 65 years and be killed only by the United States. The Vancouver he set up in had about 115,000 people, a port that ran on cordage and steam, and a forest industry dominated by American mill owners shipping unsorted cargoes to California. MacMillan watched the way the trade worked and decided to change it. He chartered ships. He sorted by grade. He shipped to specific customers in specific ports. By 1920, he had brought in a quiet, methodical fellow forester named Whitford Julian Van Dusen, the same Van Dusen for whom Vancouver's botanical garden is now named, as his manager. By 1924, he had added a shipping company, the Canadian Transport Company, which would grow into one of the largest chartered cargo fleets in the world. He had begun, in other words, to build a global forestry business from a single Vancouver office, and nobody in the seaboard lumber sales cartel of established BC mill owners knew quite what to make of him. So in 1928, they tried to shut him out. The cartel froze him out of the consortium that controlled coastal mill output. They believed it would finish him. It did the opposite. It pushed him downstream into the mills themselves. Canadian White Pine in Vancouver, a new plywood plant in 1935. The Alberni Pacific Lumber Company in Port Alberni, with its Rockefeller family timber, stands in 1936. And by 1938, the man the seaboard cartel had tried to squeeze out was the largest lumber producer on the British Columbia coast. The penny he had lost as a boy had become a forest. Chapter 2. The Empire of Wood. The forest he had acquired was not, however, his alone. There was another company on the coast, older than his, in some ways stranger than his, and the story of MacMillan Bloedel cannot be told without telling theirs. Julius Harold Bloedel was a lumberman from Bellingham, Washington, the kind of American capitalist who had moved north when the Pacific Northwest forests of his own country had started to thin. In 1911, with two Canadian railway contractors named John W. Stewart and Patrick Welch, the same trio that built much of the Grand Trunk Pacific, he founded Bloedel, Stewart and Welch on Vancouver Island. Stewart and Welch were silent partners with capital. J.H. Bloedel was the operator, and in 1929, his Yale-educated son Prentice joined the firm, and the company began to do something that no other coastal logging outfit was doing. It started thinking about the second cut. In the 1930s, while every other operator on the coast was clear-cutting and walking away, Bloedel, Stewart, and Welch brought the first Lidgerwood steel spar yarder to Canada. In 1938, it became the first BC logging company to plant seedlings on logged-over land. By 1948, a decade in which most of the industry still treated reforestation as something for governments to worry about, Bloedel, Stewart, and Welch was responsible for 70% of all private sector replanting in the province. The same company name that would, a half-century later, become the most famous symbol of West Coast clear-cut destruction had begun life as the most quietly progressive forester in British Columbia. Prentice Bloedel had been watching MacMillan export for years. In 1950, convinced, as he later put it, that small firms had no future, he wrote to MacMillan. He proposed a merger. The deal was negotiated quickly. The two companies were complementary, almost to the point of design. MacMillan had the export channels and the brokerage, and the global customers. Bloedel had the timber and the mills, and the conservation methods. The price of the merger was a $2.3 million tax bill on $16 million in pre-merger gains, a price both sides paid without flinching. In October 1951, J.H. Bloedel, then 87 years old, signed the merger papers as the last act of his working life and retired the same week. The new company was called MacMillan Bloedel. There was, however, one more piece of the coast still standing apart from them, and it was the largest piece of all. The Powell River Company had been founded in 1908 by two Americans named Dwight Brooks and Michael Scanlon. They had built a mill town at a deep-water inlet on the Sunshine Coast, and in 1912 had produced the first roll of newsprint manufactured in British Columbia. By mid-century, the Powell River Mill was the largest newsprint plant on Earth. The company was run by the Foley brothers, Harold and Joe, and the Foleys had built a corporate culture that could not have differed more sharply from MacBlo's. Powell River was paternalistic, generous, and a little slow. The Bloedel side of the merged company was famously Calvinist in its efficiency. The MacMillan side was famously sharp. On December 31, 1959, the three companies merged in a stock swap that created MacMillan, Bloedel, and Powell River Limited. What followed was, in the words of one historian who lived through it, one of the nastiest corporate fights in Canadian history. The Calvinist Vancouverites moved on Powell River like a hostile occupation. The Foley brothers were gone by the middle of 1961. The company was renamed MacMillan Bloedel Limited in 1966. And on the BC coast, from Powell River to Port Alberni to Chemainus to Harmac to Juscatla on Haida Gwaii, there was now one company that mattered more than every other forestry company in the province combined. H.R. MacMillan himself was its first chairman from 1951 to 1955. After him came Bert Hofmeister, a former major general who had commanded the 5th Canadian Armored Division through Italy and survived a famous falling out with MacMillan in 1957. After Hofmeister came the man who would shape the company more than anyone except the founder. His name was John Valentine Klein, Jack to everyone who knew him. And he had been, until the day in 1958, when MacBlo's board called him, a sitting justice of the Supreme Court of British Columbia. He had no industry experience. He had never run a sawmill. He took the chairmanship anyway, and he ran it for 15 years, and he made 3 decisions that defined what MacMillan Bloedel became. He hired McKinsey & Company in 1962 to overhaul management, one of the firm's earliest engagements in Canada. He took the company into Europe with $36 million worth of container plants in 1963. And in 1965, he picked up the telephone and called an architect named Arthur Erickson. What he asked Erickson for was a head office. What he got in 1969 was one of the most extraordinary buildings in the country, a brutalist concrete tower at 1075 West Georgia Street in downtown Vancouver, with load-bearing concrete walls that tapered from 10 feet thick at the base to 1 foot at the top, deep coffered ceilings, and great 7 by 7 foot windows set into the concrete like portholes. Erickson described it, in a phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life, as a building that tapered upward like the trunk of a great tree. The Royal Architectural Institute of Canada gave it the Massey Medal in 1970. The people who actually worked in downtown Vancouver called it the concrete waffle. It looked, from the street, like the company that had built it, heavy at the base, reaching, confident. There was no shareholder filing in 1969 that mentioned the building's other quality, the one that has only become visible with time. From a certain angle, on a certain morning, with the light coming off the harbor at just the right pitch, the Erickson Tower at 1075. West Georgia looks exactly like what it eventually became, a tombstone for a forest. Chapter 3. The Concrete Waffle. By the time the tower opened, the empire it commanded reached every navigable inlet on the BC coast and most of the major rivers behind them. In the Alberni Valley, where Highway 4 dropped down through the mountains and arrived at the head of a long fjord, MacMillan Bloedel ran the largest sawmill complex in the British Commonwealth, a working town built around 5 mills, a deep-water port, and a railway, the Alberni Pacific, that ran log trains down out of the hills the way coal trains used to run down out of Cape Breton. The whistle in Port Alberni in 1969 was not a metaphor. It was a noise that organized the day. Workers heard it in their kitchens and reached for their lunch pails and pulled on the same wool jackets their fathers had worn into the same mills, and they walked the same streets through the same coastal drizzle to do work that paid the highest median industrial wage of any town in British Columbia. Up the coast at Powell River, the great newsprint mill ran 24 hours a day, 6 rolls of paper per machine per minute, and the Green River running past it carried the chips and the bark and the chemical bloom that the people of Powell River had learned to live with, the way the people of Sydney, Nova Scotia, had learned to live with the sulfur. The smell was the smell of a paycheck. The largest self-dumping log barge ever built had been pioneered at Powell River, a vessel that could roll its own load into the harbor in less than a minute, a piece of West Coast engineering that nobody back east had ever quite understood. Cargo ships left for Tokyo and Sydney and Auckland and Manila, with their holds full of newsprint that would, in the morning, be the front page of newspapers nobody in Powell River would ever read. South of Nanaimo, at the Harmac Craft Pulp Mill, named in 1950 by stitching together the first letters of H.R.V. Reginald MacMillan, the sulfurous breath of the craft process drifted across the strait toward Gabriola Island on the prevailing westerlies. Old hands at Harmac said you could smell the mill before you could see it. They were right. The craft odor is one of the most recognizable industrial smells in Canada. And on a damp February morning in 1972, it could carry 20 miles. It was a smell that locals, with the same dry resignation as their counterparts in Sydney, referred to as the smell of money. In Chemainus, on the east coast of Vancouver Island, the old Victoria lumber sawmill that MacMillan had taken over near the end of the Second World War turned out fir and hemlock for the housing markets of California and Japan. In Crofton, a bleached pulp mill ran on hog fuel and salt water. At Juscatla, on the dirt roads of Graham Island in Haida Gwaii, the company cut the largest Sitka spruce on Earth, trees that had been standing when the Magna Carta was signed, brought down by chainsaws and loaded onto barges and shipped south. Some of those Juscatla logs went straight to the company's plywood plant. Some went into rolled-edge panels for Boeing aircraft factories down the coast. Some went to the violin makers of Central Europe, who knew that no other spruce in the world had quite the resonance of the spruce that grew in the rain shadow of the San Cristobal Mountains. If you worked the green chain at the Alberni Pacific Mill in 1972, this is what your day looked like. You started before dawn. You walked through a parking lot of pickup trucks with hockey sticks across their back windows. You punched in. You stood for 8 hours in front of a moving belt of sawn lumber as it came out of the head rig, and you graded each board for knot density and grain, and you flicked the rejects sideways with a hooked stick whose name and shape had not changed since the 1880s. The boards moved past you at the speed of a slow walk. Your hands learned them. Your back learned them. The cold rain learned the shape of your shoulders through the open ends of the mill shed, because the mill, like most sawmills in coastal British Columbia, had walls only where it needed them, at one end. Everywhere else, it was open to the weather. The accents you heard on either side of you depended on the year. In the 1920s and 1930s, the fallers on the coastal sides were largely Scandinavian. Swedes from Västerbotten, Norwegians from Trøndelag, Finns from Karelia, men who had crossed an ocean and a continent because the forests they grew up in had already been cut. Sikh and Punjabi workers, who had been arriving since before the First World War, had been segregated by the lumber operators into the lowest paid jobs on the green chain and in the boom yards, and the segregation outlasted the men who had set it up. Japanese-Canadian workers had vanished from the camps in 1942, the year their families were sent to the interior under the War Measures Act. Chinese-Canadian, Polish, Ukrainian, and Czech workers filled the bunkhouses in the post-war years, and the men who had been on the coast longer than any of them, Nucha Nolth fallers from Ahousaht and Tlaoquiat, Kwakwakawaku boom men from the Broughton, Coast Salish skidder operators from the Squamish, worked the camps the way their grandfathers had worked them, and were paid the way the company paid indigenous labor, which was to say, less. The man who organized them was Jack Monroe. Monroe had taken over the International Woodworkers of America in 1973 and would run it until 1992. And at the height of his power, he could shut down every MacBlo operation on the coast with a single phone call. He was the most powerful labor leader in Western Canada. He was also, in the way of West Coast industrial leaders, a personal friend of the men who ran the company across the table from him. He drank with them. He hunted with them. He fought them, sometimes brutally. The 1986 IWA strike lasted 4.5 months, and then he sat down with them, and they signed the next contract. It was an arrangement that worked because everyone involved understood that they were inside the same forest. None of them, in 1972, could yet imagine a year in which the forest would no longer belong to them. Chapter 4. A Coast That Lived by Wood. The towns where the work happened were small. They were almost all on water. Most of them had been built by the company that now ran them, and most of them had no other reason to exist. Powell River's old town site, around the original Brooks Scanlon Mill, is now a National Historic Site, a planned company town of identical clapboard cottages laid out in 1910, along streets named for the founding executives. There are towns like it in northern Ontario and in the eastern townships of Quebec, but Powell River is the largest surviving example on the BC coast. And the reason it survives so completely is that it never developed any other industry around it to encrust the original plan. The mill ran. The town served the mill. The mill closed. The town remains, the way a body remains after the heart has stopped. Port Alberni was bigger and louder. At its peak in the early 1970s, it had 30,000 people, a hockey arena that filled to capacity on Saturday nights, 3 Catholic parishes serving 3 distinct immigrant communities, and a Legion Hall where the Second World War veterans of the Canadian-Scottish Regiment drank rye whiskey in the same booth they had drunk it in since 1946. A 1974 memoir by a Port Alberni resident described the streets that year. Boats, campers, and Winnebagos in every driveway. The driveways belonged to mill hands and chokermen and rigging slingers. The Winnebagos had been bought with overtime. Caminas was smaller, a single big sawmill, a couple of churches, a main street that looked out over the strait toward Salt Spring Island. Harmac was barely a town at all, more a collection of mill workers' homes scattered along the road south of Nanaimo. Crofton, Yubu, Tassis, Gold River, Juscatla, Honeymoon Bay, the names of the mill towns of the BC coast in the late 1960s, read like the timetable of a coastal freighter, which is what most of them were. The boats came in. The lumber went out. The checks cashed on Fridays. The checks were what built the coast. In 1972, a sawyer at the Alberni Mill could buy a 3-bedroom house on a 60-foot lot with a view of the inlet and a year-round salmon run at the bottom of the garden and pay the mortgage off in 15 years. His wife did not have to work unless she wanted to. His children did not have to leave Port Alberni unless they wanted to. There were apprenticeships in the mill for boys who didn't want to go to university. There were teaching jobs and nursing jobs and clerical jobs in the town for girls who didn't want to leave. There were union pensions that would carry a family for another 30 years after the last shift had been worked. The Vancouver newspapers, on the days the Port Alberni hockey team played, sent reporters up the highway because the team was good. There were 3 movie theaters. There was a curling rink. The schools were full. And behind all of it, holding all of it up, was a company that in 1969 ran on nearly 900,000 acres of forest land that it owned outright or controlled under tree farm licenses granted by the province of British Columbia, beginning with the system Chief Justice Gordon Sloan had designed in his 1947 Royal Commission on Forest Resources and consolidated in his second commission of 1956. The TFLs were a quintessentially BC arrangement, a marriage of Crown land and private mills under sustained yield management, and MacBlo held the largest portfolio of them on the coast. Tree farm license. 44 covered the Alberni Valley. Tree farm license. 39 covered most of the Central Coast. There were holdings on Haida Gwaii and at the head of Butte Inlet and along the Sunshine Coast. The company did not own the land. The province did. But on the land, in the forest, in the day-to-day reality of what was cut and when and how, MacBlo's word was the word. By 1969, the company employed about 17,000 people. By 1979, it would employ 24,500. It was, by a long distance, the largest single industrial employer in the province. Its log exports accounted for 1/3 of all the lumber British Columbia sold to the world. Its newsprint went to 123 countries. Its tugboats and barges and self-dumping ships were the largest privately owned coastal fleet in Canada. The board of directors of MacMillan Bloedel Limited, sitting in the 11th floor boardroom of the Ericsson Tower with the harbor spread out below them, had at their disposal a forest the size of Switzerland and a workforce larger than the population of Prince Edward Island's capital city. It was an empire. Everyone knew it was an empire. The people who worked inside it were proud of it, in the quiet, undemonstrative way that working-class Canadians have always been proud of the things they built. They were proud that MacBlo's lumber framed the houses of post-war Saskatoon and Calgary and Hamilton. They were proud that MacBlo's plywood lined the bombers Boeing rolled out of Renton, Washington, and the trawlers that worked the Atlantic out of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. They were proud that the newsprint they made in Powell River carried the morning's news to Sydney and Singapore and São Paulo. They were proud of being good at it. What none of them could see, from inside the empire, was how short the empire was about to be. Chapter 5. 24,500. The peak came in 1979. That year, MacMillan Bloedel employed 24,500 people across operations in 5 countries. Sales reached almost 2 billion Canadian dollars. The company controlled close to 1 million acres of forest land in British Columbia alone. It accounted by itself for a third of the province's lumber exports. Its head office in the Ericsson Tower employed several hundred white-collar professionals: foresters, accountants, lawyers, traders, shipping managers, and the company expense account ran a corporate jet between Vancouver and the eastern Canadian and U.S. cities where the rest of the boardroom met. The jet was a Falcon. It was painted in the company's colors. Pilots said it was the cleanest aircraft they had ever flown. In Port Alberni, the highest-paid mill hands in Canada bought new pickup trucks every other autumn and pulled their Winnebagos out of the driveway for 2-week vacations on the long, sandy beaches of Long Beach, an hour west of town on the Pacific. In Powell River, the newsprint mill ran 6 machines and made enough paper in a day to wrap around the equator. In Camines and at Harmac and on Haida Gwaii, the men who did the work went home tired and went out to the Legion on Friday nights and bought their kids hockey gear at the start of every season and made plans for retirement that involved cabins on lakes within a half-hour drive of where they had worked. There were the warning signs. There are always warning signs at peaks, and a careful observer, in 1979, could have listed them. The Canadian transport shipping arm had collapsed in 1975, the first operating loss MacBlo had ever booked, and the company had quietly liquidated the fleet that H.R. MacMillan had built 50 years earlier. The chairman who had presided over that loss, George Curry, had been fired the next year, along with his CEO. The shareholders had not been told the full story. The new chairman was Robert Bonner, a former Attorney General of British Columbia under Premier W.A.C. Bennett, a man who knew the politics of the province but not its forestry. Below Bonner, the day-to-day was being run by managers who had been hired and trained by McKinsey, and who treated the company the way they had been taught to treat a balance sheet rather than the way Jack Klein had treated it, which was as a stewardship. There was also, that year, the first quiet trickle of news from Europe. A few of the smaller mills MacBlo had built in the United Kingdom in the early 1960s were underperforming. The European container business that had once been Jack Klein's strategic prize was being outcompeted by Scandinavian producers who could deliver to London at lower cost. The diversification into U.S. packaging was profitable, but it was consuming capital that the BC coastal operations needed. The pulp mills were aging. The sawmills had not been substantially modernized since the early 1960s. The Powell River newsprint machines had been running flat out for so long that the maintenance costs were beginning to compound. These were the kinds of warning signs that any large industrial company, in any era, can usually find if it looks. In 1979, nobody at MacBlo was looking very hard. The earnings were rising. The lumber market was strong. The Japanese were buying everything. The federal government in Ottawa, under Pierre Trudeau, was not interfering. The provincial government in Victoria, under the social credit premier Bill Bennett, son of the WAC. Bennett, who had appointed Robert Bonner to the bench, was a reliable industry ally. The new Ericsson Tower at 1075 West Georgia, 10 years old by 1979, and already weathered into the patina that gray concrete acquires in coastal cities, looked exactly the way the company that owned it looked: heavy, solid, permanent. It was not permanent. None of it was permanent. The forest under it was still standing because nobody had yet decided to cut it differently, and the social license that had allowed the cutting to continue, year after year and watershed after watershed, was about to fail in a way that would take the company by surprise. But that was still a few years away. In 1979, at the highest branch the company would ever climb, 24,500 people drew a MacBlo paycheck. The board of directors flew home to Vancouver in the Falcon. The shareholders were happy. The tree farm licenses were renewed. The newsprint ran 6 machines a day at Powell River, and the craft odor drifted east across the Strait of Georgia from Harmac, and the Sitka spruce on Haida Gwaii grew another fraction of an inch, and the lumber kept moving out of Port Alberni on freighters bound for the world. 24,500. It is a number worth saying twice. By 1999, it would be 9,500. By 2006, after Weyerhaeuser had sold the remains, it would be effectively zero. The forest would still be there. The mill towns would still be there. But the company that had owned them, in any meaningful sense of the word, would be gone. Sold in the end, over a single weekend, at a hotel in Richmond, under a name that had nothing to do with timber. What happened in between is what the rest of this story is about. Chapter 6. Toronto. What happened in between began, like most of what was about to happen to MacBlo, with a phone call from somewhere east of the Rockies. The first sign that anything was wrong was a takeover bid. In the spring of 1981, MacMillan Bloedel attempted to acquire Domtar, the Eastern Canadian paper and packaging company, in what would have been a transformational deal, a coastal forestry giant absorbing an Ontario pulp and paper company and becoming a national champion. The bid was so badly mishandled that it triggered the opposite of what its authors had intended. Domtar's defenders launched a counterbid for MacBlo. Then Canadian Pacific, sensing weakness, launched its own counterbid. By July, the largest forestry company in the country was suddenly, surprisingly, in play. In Victoria, the social credit premier Bill Bennett looked at the field of suitors and decided that the lesser evil was a Canadian mining company. Noranda Mines Limited, run from Toronto by an executive named Adam Hartley Zimmerman, paid $623 million for a 49% controlling interest. It was the largest corporate takeover in Canadian history to that date. 5 Noranda directors took seats on the MacBlo board. The chairman's office at 1075 West Georgia kept its concrete walls and its tapering windows. The chairman who sat in it now answered to a boardroom 2,000 miles away. 3 weeks after the Noranda acquisition closed, in the kind of cascading transaction that defined Canadian capitalism in the early 1980s, another holding company called Brascade Resources acquired 42% of Noranda. Brascade was a joint venture between the Bronfman family's Edper Investments and the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec. In a single summer, control of British Columbia's largest industrial company had passed from Vancouver to Toronto to Montreal. 3 head offices, none of them within 1,000 miles of a sawmill the company owned. The investment banker Peter Brown, who watched it happen from his desk in downtown Vancouver, put it later to the Globe and Mail in the kind of plain sentence that pretended to explain something it could not undo. It changed once it was controlled by Noranda. It's only natural you will do more in the town you live in than in the town you don't live in. The natural thing in 1982 was a recession, the worst British Columbia forestry had seen since the 1930s. American housing starts collapsed. Japanese lumber buyers retreated. MacBlo's earnings reversed. The company that had earned 24,500 paychecks in 1979 booked a loss of $57 million on $1.8 billion in sales in 1982 and laid off, across the coast, nearly a fifth of its workforce. 40,000 BC forestry workers lost their jobs that year. 8,000 of them were MacBlo's. The company Jet, the Falcon, the one whose pilots had said it was the cleanest aircraft they had ever flown, was sold. The Ericsson Tower itself was sold to a property syndicate and leased back. Adam Zimmerman, in Toronto, ordered a halt to capital spending at the Powell River and Harmac Mills. The aging newsprint machines at Powell River would now run as long as they could without renewal. The craft digesters at Harmac would do the same. There was no announcement. There rarely is, in a branch plant economy, on the day the parent company quietly decides that the operations it bought are no longer worth investing in. The announcement came in the silence of the capital budget. Powell River, in 1983, was a mill being run for cash. 5 years earlier, it had been the largest newsprint plant on Earth. It would never again be the largest anything. The white-collar professionals at 1075 West Georgia began, around this time, to notice the change in atmosphere. The big decisions were no longer made on the 11th floor. They were made in Toronto. The Vancouver office became, in the casual language of the people who worked there, a regional office. The board still met in the tapering tower above the harbor. But the boardroom in which the real decisions got made was on King Street West, in a building that had no Sitka spruce in it. H.R. MacMillan had died in 1976, 5 years before the MacBlo Takeover, at 90 years of age. He was buried in Vancouver after a private Quaker service. He had endowed, by then, the H.R. MacMillan Planetarium, and the Vancouver Aquarium's Gallery of Whales, and the Bloedel Conservatory, and the H.R. MacMillan Chair of Forestry at the University of British Columbia. He had given away an estimated $40 million in his lifetime. His daughter Jean, 20 years later, would tell a reporter that her father would never have allowed what happened next. She was almost certainly right. But by 1983, her father was already gone, and the company that bore his name was being run, for the first time in its history, by people who had never stood in a Port Alberni sawmill at the start of a January shift and watched their breath freeze on the boards moving past them in the cold. Chapter 7. A Minor Dose of Acne. On April 21, 1984, MacMillan Bloedel announced that it intended to clear-cut 90% of Mears Island. Mears Island is in Clayoquot Sound, off the west coast of Vancouver Island, directly across the inlet from the village of Tofino. It is the traditional territory of the Tlaoquiot and Ahusat peoples. It has stood of giant western red cedar and Sitka spruce that were old when Captain Cook arrived in 1778. MacBlo held a tree farm license over it. The trees, by every legal definition that mattered to the Forest Service in Victoria, were the company's to cut. Chief Councillor Moses Martin of the Tlaoquiot First Nation disagreed. On the day MacBlo's logging crews arrived in their boats at the south end of the island, Martin and his people were already there. He had declared Mears Island a tribal park. He met the company flotilla on the beach. The line he gave them that morning is one of the most quoted sentences in modern Canadian environmental history, and it had nothing in it of confrontation. "You are welcome to come ashore and join us for a meal," he told the loggers. "But you have to leave your chainsaws in your boats." It was the first major logging blockade in Canadian history. By that November, there were several hundred people on the island. By the spring of 1985, the Tlaoquiot and the Friends of Clayoquot Sound had taken MacBlo to court. On March 27, 1985, in a decision written by Justice Peter Seaton and decided 3-2, the British Columbia Court of Appeal granted an injunction against logging on Mears Island pending the resolution of the underlying question of Aboriginal title. The injunction remains in force. 40 years later, the trial has never resumed. The trees have never been cut. A few months later, on Haida Gwaii, the islands the company called the Queen Charlottes, where MacBlo's Juskatla division cut the largest Sitka spruce on Earth, the Haida Nation began its own blockades on the island they called Athli Gwaii, and that everyone else called Lyle. The Haida won too. In 1988, the federal government created the Gwaii Hana's National Park Reserve, co-managed by Parks Canada and the Council of the Haida Nation. The southern third of MacBlo's Haida Gwaii tenure passed permanently out of the company's hands. This was a new kind of trouble. It was not the trouble of a recession, which a forestry company knew how to survive. You laid off, you waited, you came back. It was not the trouble of a strike, which Jack Monroe could be persuaded to settle. It was the trouble of a population that had lived on a coast for 10,000 years, rediscovering, in the late 20th century, that the legal foundation on which the company stood was not as solid as everyone in 1969 had believed it to be. The man who answered for MacBlo in those years was Adam Zimmerman. He had been chairman since 1983 and was reportedly the most powerful businessman in central Canada. He was clever, profane, well-read, and famously dismissive of environmental criticism. In a 1990 interview with the documentary series BC, An Untold History, asked about the visual impact of clear-cut logging on the coastal landscape, Zimmerman delivered a sentence that traveled around the world before he had finished saying it. At the worst, he said, "It will look like a minor dose of acne." The Greenpeace organizers in Amsterdam who heard the recording understood immediately what they had been given. They produced posters. They produced full-page newspaper advertisements in Germany and the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. They referred from that point onward to MacMillan Bloedel's operations on the BC coast as clear-cut acne, and to British Columbia itself, with deliberate provocation, as the Brazil of the North. The phrase stuck. It would be used by the European customers of MacMillan Bloedel newsprint in the cancellation letters they would begin to send within 3 years. Adam Zimmerman did not, then or later, retract the line. He was, in his way, an honest man. He believed what he said. He had grown up in a Canada in which the forest was an industrial resource, and the men who cut it were the men who built the country, and he could not see, from his office in Toronto, what had changed about the world that made his sentence into something other than a perfectly defensible piece of corporate candor. What had changed was the audience. What had changed was that the audience now included Tilla o Quiot canoes on a beach in Clayoquot Sound, and Haida totem carvers on a road on Lyell Island, and a generation of European consumers who had been told by people in Amsterdam who knew how to make them believe it, that the paper in their morning newspaper was made by cutting down a 1,000-year-old tree. In 1990, when Zimmerman gave the interview, the European book and newspaper customers of MacMillan Bloedel were already starting to ask uncomfortable questions about where the pulp had come from. Within 3 years, they would not be asking. They would be canceling. Chapter 8. The War in the Woods. The break came in the summer of 1993. On April 13th of that year, the new Democratic Party Premier of British Columbia, Mike Harcourt, announced that approximately 2/3 of the 350,000 hectares of Clayoquot Sound would be open to industrial logging under a new land use plan. MacMillan Bloedel held the license. Within a week of the announcement, the Friends of Clayoquot Sound, a small environmental group operating out of a Tofino storefront, led by an organizer named Valerie Langer, had begun planning what they referred to, with prairie understatement, as a peace camp. The peace camp, when it opened in July, sat in a logged-over clear-cut they had named the Black Hole. From July through October, by Friends of Clayoquot Sound's later accounting, roughly 12,000 people passed through it. They came from Vancouver, from Victoria, from Calgary, from Toronto, from California, from Germany. They were students and grandmothers, and Indigenous activists, and middle-aged Vancouverites who had never been arrested for anything in their lives. They walked, in shifts, to a logging road called Kennedy Lake. They sat down on it. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrested them. By the end of the summer, 859 people had been arrested, tried, and convicted in the British Columbia Supreme Court for criminal contempt of an injunction obtained by MacMillan Bloedel. On a single day, August 9, 1993, 300 protesters were arrested. It was, until the Fairy Creek blockades a generation later, the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. came to the Black Hole. Peter Garrett, the lead singer of Midnight Oil and a future Australian Environment Minister, came and stood in the rain with a megaphone. Tom Cruise sent a statement of support. So did Robert Redford. So did Oliver Stone. But the part of the campaign that mattered most to MacMillan Bloedel did not happen at the Black Hole. It happened in Hamburg and Frankfurt and Munich, and at the headquarters of a British home improvement chain called B&Q, on an industrial estate outside Eastleigh in Hampshire. It happened at the New York Times. It happened at Scott Paper and at Kimberly-Clark's Kleenex division, and at the publishing houses of Random House and Knopf Canada. Valerie Langer, recalling it years later, used the only words that needed to be used. "We were going around to their customers," she said, "getting contract cancellations, so hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts were canceled." The phrase that traveled with the campaign was the one Greenpeace had been using since 1990, the Brazil of the North. European publishers and German newspapers announced clear-cut-free paper policies. Scott Paper, Kimberly-Clark, and B&Q canceled MacBlo contracts. The New York Times audited its newsprint supplier. The aggregate value of the cancellations, by the best contemporary estimates, was something north of 200 million Canadian dollars. In the head office at 1075 West Georgia, the new chief executive officer Robert Findlay made a decision that would, more than any other internal hire of the decade, change the company's relationship with its own collapse. He created a new position called Vice President, Environmental Affairs. He gave it to a 40-year-old former Federal Environment Ministry official named Linda Cody. According to a story Cody later told, Findlay's instruction to her on her first day was a single sentence. "Do anything that might work," he said. "Nothing has so far." Cody was the first MacBlo executive to take the environmental campaign seriously, not as a public relations problem, but as a market problem. She began meeting, quietly, with Zepra Berman and Valerie Langer of the Friends of Clayoquot Sound. Berman later said of her, in the kind of compliment opponents rarely pay to opponents, "Cody was the first person I met from a logging company who really talked to us, and about the issues, instead of trying to spin them." She crossed sides intellectually, Berman said, long before she crossed them institutionally. While Cody was beginning that work in Vancouver, something else was happening in Toronto. The Bronfman family's Hees Edper conglomerate, the holding company that, through Brascade and Noranda, sat at the top of the pyramid that controlled MacMillan Bloedel, was in trouble. Years of leveraged acquisitions had left the empire overextended, and by the early 1990s, its bankers were demanding action. On a single night in February 1993, in a transaction the press called the Great Edper Lawn Sale, Hees Edper dumped its controlling stakes in both MacMillan Bloedel and the brewing company John Labatt. The combined transaction was reported at roughly $2 billion. MacBlo was now what corporate analysts called widely held, which is the polite term for a company that no longer has a controlling shareholder and therefore no longer has anyone, in particular, looking after it. It was widely held in February 1993. The Clayoquot arrests began in July. The customer cancellations began that autumn. By 1995, when Justice Stephen Owen's scientific panel on sustainable forest practices in Clayoquot Sound issued 127 unanimous recommendations, and the NDP government accepted all of them. The tree farm license over Clayoquot, the same license MacBlo had announced it would log in April 1993, had been rendered effectively uneconomic. In 1996, the Forest Practices Code came fully into force across the province, multiplying the cost of every cubic meter of timber MacBlo could legally take off the coast. And then, in the summer of 1997, the bottom dropped out of the Japanese economy. Japan, in 1996, was about a quarter of MacBlo's worldwide lumber sales by value. The Asian financial crisis cut those sales in half within months. For the year ending December 31, 1997, MacMillan Bloedel Limited reported a net loss of $368 million after an after-tax write-down of $340 million on operations that no longer made any economic sense to maintain. The largest industrial company in the history of British Columbia had become, in the language of the financial press, a turnaround candidate. It needed someone to turn it around. In September 1997, the board hired an American. Chapter 9. Get Off Your Lazy Assets. His name was Tom Stevens. He was an Arkansas-born former executive of the Manville Corporation of Denver, a company best known for its asbestos liabilities. He arrived at 1075 West Georgia in September 1997, with a reputation for what business journalists called toughness, a brutal sense of humor, and a single sentence with which he addressed the senior managers who had survived the previous 5 years of decline. The line, as remembered by MacBlo's former chief forester Bill Cafferata in a 2003 interview with the Ivy Business Journal, was characteristic. "Sell it, milk it, or grow it," Stevens told them. "Get off your lazy assets." He launched a 90-day strategic review conducted by an internal council of consultants. He fired through the middle management of the company. He sold off the eastern U.S. packaging operations that had absorbed so much of the company's capital in the 1980s. He spun off the papermaking business, the Powell River and Port Alberni newsprint mills, together with the medium-density fiberboard mills, into a separate public company called Pacifica Papers. Roughly 1,300 BC jobs disappeared in that one transaction. Then he sat down with Linda Cody and asked her, in essence, What would actually fix the problem at Clayoquot? What Cody had been working on for 3 years was an idea that had been considered impossible inside the company until Stevens arrived. The idea was that MacMillan Bloedel could stop clear-cutting. On June 10, 1998, on the steps of the Ericsson Tower, Tom Stevens announced what the company called the Forest Project. Over the next 5 years, MacBlo would phase out clear-cutting on its 1.1 million hectare BC coastal tenure. It would replace it with a system called variable retention, leaving anywhere from 15 to 80% of the standing stems intact on every block cut. It was the largest concession ever made by a North American forestry company. Greenpeace, which had spent a decade campaigning against MacBlo, issued a statement of cautious approval. Interfor and Western Forest Products followed within months with similar commitments. The phrase "war in the woods" began, around that time, to appear in the past tense. Then, a year later, came the more remarkable transaction. On June 16, 1999, at a small resort on the Tofino waterfront called the Way West, in a signing ceremony attended by representatives of the 5 Nucha-Nulth Central Region First Nations, the Ahusat, the Tla'aque'eat, the Hesquiat, the Toquat, and the Uklu'elet, and by representatives of Greenpeace International, Greenpeace Canada, Sierra Club BC, the Western Canada Wilderness Committee, and the Natural Resources Defence Council, MacMillan Bloedel signed a Memorandum of Understanding, transferring effective operational control of its Clayoquot tree farm license to a new joint venture called ISAC Forest Resources Limited. ISAC was 51% owned by the Nucha-Nulth First Nations through their Ma'amook Development Corporation, and 49% owned by MacMillan Bloedel. ISAC, in the Nucha-Nulth language, is the word for respect. More fully, respect with caring. In return for the transfer, the environmental signatories agreed to promote ISAC's certified products and to end the international market campaign. ISAC committed to defer harvesting in the unprotected pristine watersheds, the Nucha-Nulth called Emius, the sacred ones, and to pursue Forest Stewardship Council certification. It received that certification in 2001. It was the first Forest Stewardship Council certified tree farm license on the British Columbia coast. The Friends of Clayoquot Sound, Valerie Langer's group, the people who had begun the black hole, declined to sign. They thought the deal did not go far enough. The Nucha-Nulth went ahead anyway. For 1998, the company that had lost $368 million the year before reported a profit of $42 million on $4.18 billion in sales. Tom Stevens had done, in 18 months, what no MacBlo executive had been able to do for 15 years. He had ended the war in the woods. He had returned the company to profit. He had handed Clayoquot Sound to the people who had been its original stewards. There were people inside the company, that spring, who thought it was the beginning of a long second act for MacMillan Bloedel, an act in which the same company that had been the symbol of clear-cut destruction would become the global model of how a coastal forester could share a forest with the people who lived in it. It was not the beginning of a second act. It was the last 6 months. Chapter 10. The Robertsons. On the afternoon of April 22, 1999, Tom Stevens' secretary put through a call from the recently appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Weyerhaeuser Company of Federal Way, Washington. His name was Stephen Rogel. He had been hired by Weyerhaeuser the previous December. He had a strategy. The strategy was to acquire MacMillan Bloedel. He made his first offer that day. Stevens turned it down. He made a second offer. It was turned down. He made a third. It was turned down. The fourth offer was an exchange ratio. Weyerhaeuser would offer 0.28 of one of its own shares for every share of MacBlo. At the Friday, close on June 18th, that put a Weyerhaeuser bid at roughly $28.60 Canadian against MacBlo's closing price of $21.05, a 36% premium. Over the weekend of June 19, 1999, the lawyers from both sides and the investment bankers from RBC Dominion Securities met at a hotel in Richmond, the suburb south of the Vancouver airport. The block booking had been made under a cover name. It was not, the booking suggested, a corporate negotiation. It was a family reunion. The Robertsons. The name appeared on the conference room door. The hotel staff brought coffee for the Robertson family weekend gathering. Stevens, asked later by McLean's why the cover name, said it was the only way the team could work without drawing attention. 80 MacBlo employees were called on Sunday evening. They came into the Ericsson Tower in shirt sleeves. They worked through the night. On the night before the announcement, Stevens called Premier Glenn Clark and Forest Minister Dave Zernhelt. He told them what was about to happen. According to a McLean's reconstruction published 2 weeks later, he also told them that to oppose the deal would be political suicide. The announcement came on Monday, June 21, 1999. 3.6 billion Canadian dollars, 2.45 billion US. An all-stock transaction, a $92 million breakup fee if either side walked away. MacMillan Bloedel had 9,500 employees that morning, 5,500 in Canada, 3,700 in British Columbia. The joint press release used the language of corporate optimism. "We believe that this combination will create the powerhouse in the industry," the statement read. While we were not seeking a merger of this nature, the terms of this agreement provide an attractive premium to our shareholders. The reaction in British Columbia was not what the company had expected. The reaction was a kind of stunned, gathering silence. Dave Haggard, the president of the Industrial Wood and Allied Workers Union, demanded job and tenure guarantees. He did not get them. Ken Druschka, the biographer who had spent 20 years writing about H.R. MacMillan and the BC forest industry, told Maclean's he was amazed by the lack of opposition. The former chief executive officer Ray Smith, the man who had run the company through most of the Noranda decade, was asked by a reporter outside the Ericsson Tower how he felt about the sale. "This is just another chapter," Smith said, "in the evolution of the forest business in BC." Forest Minister Zernhelt told the same reporter that you may say it's unfortunate that a BC company is being sold, but that's the way the world is now. Jean Southam, the daughter of H.R. MacMillan, gave an interview to the Vancouver Sun that week. The line she gave the reporter was the line that would, more than any other single sentence spoken in 1999, be remembered. This would not have happened in Daddy's heyday. The shareholders of MacMillan Bloedel Limited voted on October 28, 1999, at the Hyatt Regency in downtown Vancouver. The vote was, by every measure that mattered to the lawyers, a formality. The merger was approved. It closed in November. 80 years and 4 months after H.R. MacMillan mortgaged his house for $10,000 to match Montague Meyer's stake, MacMillan Bloedel Limited ceased to exist as an independent corporation. The Ericsson Tower at 1075 West Georgia that morning was still standing. The lobby plaque still bore the MacMillan Bloedel name. The plaque was removed within the month. Chapter 11. What the Forest Remembers. Weyerhaeuser kept the BC coastal operations for 5.5 years. Then it sold them. In May 2005, the Weyerhaeuser Company of Federal Way, Washington, announced that it had reached an agreement to sell its British Columbia Coastal Group, the former MacMillan Bloedel, to Brascan Corporation, the Bronfman-controlled Toronto holding company that had been renamed Brookfield. The price was approximately 1.2 billion Canadian dollars. The assets included 258,000 hectares of private timberlands, 3.6 million cubic meters of annual crown harvest rights, 5 sawmills, and 2 remanufacturing facilities. Brookfield placed the private timberlands in a limited partnership called Island Timberlands. It placed the crown tenure sawmills in a company called Cascadia Forest Products. 6 months later, in November 2005, Brookfield sold Cascadia to Western Forest Products for approximately $120 million plus working capital. The transaction closed in the first quarter of 2006. The former MacMillan Bloedel coastal operations, which had been valued at 3.6 billion Canadian dollars in 1999, had been resold for a fraction of that figure within 7 years. The intervening 7 years had not been kind to the asset base. The Powell River Mill, the world's largest newsprint plant at mid-century, the cradle of the BC forest industry, the place where Brooks and Scanlon had begun the whole story in 1908, was indefinitely curtailed by its then-owner, Paper Excellence, on December 1, 2021. and permanently closed in August 2023. It had run for 109 years. Dave Formosa, the mayor of Powell River and the son and nephew and brother of mill workers, told the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation that his father had worked at that mill, that he himself had worked at that mill, that his brothers had worked at that mill, that his uncles had all worked at that mill when they had immigrated from Malta. The Tla'amin Nation, on whose territory the mill stands, signed a memorandum of understanding with the BC government on the reclamation of the Tisquat village site beneath the mill. The Somas sawmill at Port Alberni was indefinitely curtailed by Western Forest Products in 2017. 70 jobs were lost. The city of Port Alberni bought the 43-acre Somas lands in 2021. The Alberni paper mill, the smaller of the two on the inlet, is still operating under paper excellence with about 310 employees. The Camanus mill closed in 1983. 700 jobs were lost. The town that had been built around it could have died the way Port Alberni almost died, and the way Powell River is dying now. It did something else instead. Under the direction of a Romanian immigrant named Carl Schutz and the mayor of the day, Graham Bruce, the town commissioned a series of large outdoor murals on the walls of its Main Street buildings, depicting scenes from the lumber industry and the community's history. There are now more than 70 of them. The town came to be known as the little town that did. Carl Schutz spent the rest of his life consulting on similar mural projects in roughly 70 other municipalities in 61 countries. He died in Camanus in 2018 at the age of 92. The Harmac Craft Pulp Mill, the one named for the founder, the one whose smell had drifted across the strait toward Gabriola Island for 60 years, was sold by Weyerhaeuser to the American firm Pope & Talbot in 2007. Pope & Talbot went bankrupt in 2008. The mill was scheduled to close. 320 workers were about to lose their jobs. What happened then is the story this documentary will end on. A group of Harmac employees, together with 3 local investors, the Sampson family of Nanaimo Forest Products, Pioneer Log Homes of Williams Lake, and a small Vancouver Island investment company called Totzauer Holdings, purchased the mill out of the Pope & Talbot bankruptcy on August 30, 2008 for $13,200,000. They renamed the operating company Nanaimo Forest Products. They restarted production on October 3, 2008. They paid their first dividend to employee owners in 2011. The mill is still running. It employs over 320 people. It produces northern bleached softwood kraft pulp for paper customers in Asia and the Americas. It sells surplus green power to BC Hydro. It is, today, the only piece of the original MacMillan Bloedel constellation of mills on the BC coast that has not been closed, curtailed, or absorbed into a larger company. It is the only piece that is owned, in any meaningful sense, by the people who work in it. The Erickson Tower at 1075 West Georgia still stands. The concrete walls still taper from 10 feet at the base to 1 foot at the top. The Massey Medal of 1970 is still attached to the lobby wall. The tenants on the floors above are a mix of law firms and consulting practices, and the western office of an Asian bank. The plaque that named the building's original tenant is gone. The H.R. MacMillan Planetarium is still in Vanier Park. The Bloedel Conservatory is still in Queen Elizabeth Park. The H.R. MacMillan Space Center still teaches schoolchildren about the stars. The chair of forestry MacMillan endowed at the University of British Columbia is still teaching foresters, although it no longer trains them for the company that paid for the chair. The Mears Island injunction has never been lifted. 40 years after Moses Martin met the MacBlo flotilla on the beach and told them to leave their chainsaws in their boats, the trial in Teleoquiat versus the Queen has never resumed. The largest cedars in Clayoquot Sound are still standing. Isaac Forest Resources, in 2005, bought out Weyerhaeuser's 49% interest. It is today 100% owned by the New-Cha-Nulth Central Region First Nations. It is the first 100% First Nations-owned tree farm license on the British Columbia coast. Isak, in the New-Cha-Nulth language, is the word for respect. The penny that H.R. MacMillan lost as a boy in Pine Orchard, Ontario, has come back, in the slow way these things come back, to the people who were on the coast a long time before he ever saw it. The forest itself is still there. The company that built modern British Columbia is not.